Hello and welcome back to another lesson in class, and the last lesson, well, in science, right? Lesson 39. This will be the science of storytelling. Now, by this point, you should have creativity on lock, and then, of course, you have your logic and all those lessons there mixed with a little bit of art, now science. So now we're going to start combining everything, and not only combining fact, fiction, and myth and legend and things like that, but making some connections along the way because of our understanding now of metaphor, analogy, and entendre, and using that in combination or in lieu with everything. Think of this like a philosophical English class for those of you out there, right? So let's get into the science of storytelling. Why is storytelling not just an art? See, the reason why storytelling is not just an art is because it can be utilized in several different ways. See, there are ways that people understand things and they retain them better depending on how the communication is presented, right? How many of you have a favorite movie or TV show or book, right, that tells a story and you retain that better than some of the stuff that you were taught in school, right? Or in other disciplines and things like that, right? So the way the communication pattern or the tone and pitch, and or I should say the way it's pitched, right? If you're in business, right? You would understand what a pitch is, right? If you're, telling a story, how are you going to tell the story? How are you going to pitch it to everybody, right? So, these things do matter because if you want people to retain something, well, in school, shouldn't you also do the same, not only in life, but with other things as well? And then, of course, with metaphor, analogy, and entendre, you can always put in hidden meanings to people that understand, that diversify their vocabulary. Right? Diversification comes from the finance or mathematical department because you have to have variables, and that's science. Yes or yes, right? So, storytelling is not just an art, but a science, because if you were to translate that to the media, well, that would fall underneath marketing that, well, needs technology to help people see a picture or an image, and that's a part of science. But some people might say that I'm reaching. So let's move forward to the next point so that we can go ahead and put this whole circle together along with spirituality, which we're going to get into next, along with emotions. So, how does storytelling affect people similar to hypnosis? Well, think about it, right? In hypnosis, if you allow it to happen and you want it to happen, right? A gentleman once told me how hypnosis would work. He said, think of it like this, Mike. He goes, allow manipulation to show you what the enemy is doing, and then utilize that to your advantage. So when I received that, I was just like, okay, very well. Well, if you ever gone to the Renaissance Fair or you've seen a stage hypnotist, they talk about how this, actually comes to fruition. Most of the time it's because the person volunteered and they want to be hypnotized, right? Allowing manipulation or deceit to, influence and tell you what the enemy is up to and what they're doing, right? Or what the person in front of you is doing, right? Or wants you to do. Now, through conditioning patterns and everything else, and melody or whatever, they're able to put you into a trance where you start doing odd things. How many of you have heard a story or seen a movie or have children that have done this, and now all of a sudden they think that they're Batman or Superman or Spider-Man or whomever, right? Same concept, or should I say similar concept, just in two different fields or two different areas. One is used to, well, entertain, sometimes educate. The other one is for a performance or something of that sort. So let's continue, right? Point number 3. How does storytelling affect the value of something? Well, have you ever heard the slogan, diamonds are forever, right? It's the way the story was presented, is the way that the perceived value comes to fruition, right? If Apple did not display their products or design their store a certain way, would you still pay attention to it and the store and think it's worth that much, right? I mean, think about it. A cell phone from Apple costs as much as a laptop from Windows, right? So what is the comparison there? Is it the quality? Is it the way it's made? Is it the way it's presented? What is it? That would be product marketing, and it encompasses all those things, right? Even down to the way the box opens, right? So that's one aspect of it, right? Because if it's presented well, it looks well, then it would fall in line with the saying that presentation is 9/10 of the law, right? And some of you have heard that expression before, and some of you may not have heard that expression before. But if people are going to imitate in real life what they see on television, then presentation is 9/10 of the law. Because if you're going to look like the way the criminals are presented on television, then in the real world, you're going to be spotted out very quickly. I mean, does that not make sense, especially with the analogy or the comparison to those of you who have children that all of a sudden they thought that they were a superhero at one point or a villain, right? So, I mean, does it affect the value of something, right? Is Six Flags different than, or Six Flags, Hershey Park, and all these other amusement parks, Carowinds, different from Disney? Yeah, and you could also check the scoreboard by looking at their revenue, right? Because a wise man once said that, money is not important, it's just how we keep score, right? But keep score of what? So, let's continue. Is there storytelling in spirituality? Well, I mean, if you look at all these spiritual books, they all tell a story. They use analogy, they use metaphor, they use entendre, believe it or not, because the times were different in which the time it was translated or presented, and the majority language that was being used at the time, right? And then, of course, it has to be accurate when it's being translated from one language to another, so you have to look up the etymology of the word to fully understand what's being said or told, right? And then, of course, within there's hidden meaning and knowledge and things like that, right? Remember, in another video, I said we are a direct reflection of our universe. That's why you go to a university, right? And then when you graduate, you get a degree in the arts or the sciences, right? Think about it. So, to see an image, do you always need light to see it, or can a story place an image in one's mind? Well, I mean, let's think about it, right? Back in the day, they used to tell stories by the campfire and things like that, right? And when it comes to doing that, the words and the story and everything that was being presented gave a image or put a image in someone's mind. And then later on we had books, and then people were able to formulate the worlds that they were reading about in their head. The question is, did they need to first see that in order to create it, or vice versa? Did they first need to read about it and then create the image in their mind, right? Some people would quote other things, and I'll get into it for a little bit, but, in the beginning was the Word. And then, of course, without any words, how would anything come to fruition, right? I mean, if you're a magician, you know the word abracadabra, and then you could translate abracadabra to I will create with what I speak. And I'm pretty sure that's written down somewhere. Someone spoke something and something was created. So, was the image created through word, or was the image put there by you or someone else? And then it helped formulate a different image with the description, so you could express your creativity through thought. Let's move forward, right? So that was point number 5. All right, so this is going to get fun now, right? Because remember, in another lesson, I said I was going to present things in different fashions, right? Sometimes I was going to talk like DMX, right? Or that was my worst impression. However, I can do it that way, or I could come off as a different type of poet, right? Or I can have Greek rhyme, rhythm, and time and talk about chronos and then break in some other words in order so that you can be, I don't know, majestic about it, right? Now, that's one way to get into flow, and that's what I was, going into just now, and that's because I like things like, if you ever seen Mos Def poetry, if I remember correctly, right? He used to have Def poetry, so on and so forth, or if I remember, it was spoken word. They either used to do freestyle, ciphers, all these other things, but that's what it was. So let's get into point number 6, because I'm going to be going into story here in a little bit and then showing you how to combine different stories in order to get a message or a point across. All right. So point number 6, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has a PhD, by the way, states that we learn through story. Well, if this is not the case, why do you have story time in school? Right? Is it to get something to stay in your mind? Is it to, just entertain? Because, I mean, think about it. Without a great story, how valuable would a diamond ring be? Right? Without that story, that it's valuable. Right? So does marriage matter without the diamond ring? Think about that. So how did you learn that the diamond was valuable? It cost that much, and that's what it meant. So do you learn through story? Point number 7. This brings me to the science/magic in business known as marketing. See, in marketing, there's a lot of combinations that are at play, because not only do you have to understand a individual, you have to understand masses, a large group of people, right? And then you have to cast a wide net, advertising, right? And then, of course, with that net, you have to see how many fish you catch, right? Or what you pull in, so on and so forth, as you move through the funnel. And then, of course, from there, then you go into more psychology, because you're speaking to an individual, bottom of funnel. And then, of course, the sales team, if somebody wants to do business, unless you're selling something online, has to go into further presentation in order to, close the deal. And that also requires, the understanding of different individuals. Now, when it comes to marketing, if you understand psychology, but nobody told you it was psychology and they told you to think of a number, right? So I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10, right? Or 1 and 10, right? And then just think of any number. And now I'm going to say 2 numbers. One might be yours, one might not be. So I was either thinking of the number 6, yes, no, maybe, or the number 8. If it was one of those, ask yourself why. If it was 7, ask yourself why. If you picked a different number, then it didn't matter. But, I mean, think about that for a second. Why would I hold my hands out? Why would I prompt you, right? Because in psychology, if I give you a number line, depending on who's understanding this, and who's watching this, because in different countries, they read from right to left, not left to right. So if I say, put it from 1 to 10, I drew out a mental number line. But if I say from 1 to 10, then 1's over here and 10's over here. So, I mean, think about it. Now I'm going to confuse you. Was that not binary? Because if I have 1 over here and 10 over here, but in mathematics, 0 is only used as a placeholder, then 0 does not exist, so 1 is on both sides. Is it not? So you need the differentiator, right? The variable, the introduced variable as 0, as a placeholder to show differentiation in order to make sense when it comes from looking at things from point A to point B, because mathematics would teach you that the quickest and shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but life and other things are not presented as such, right? Sometimes it's a curved line, right? And sometimes that curved line could be concave or convex. It just depends, right? Depends on circumstances, access to resources, your resourcefulness, and everything else. But it does depend. And when it comes to business, marketing is the reason you do business with all the brands that you purchase from. How many of you order stuff through Amazon? Why? You could simply go directly to a store online that makes that product, but you choose Amazon. Why? Is it the free shipping? Is it so on and so forth? Was that not magic? Did you not understand how they got you to part with your hard-earned dollars? Think about it. I mean, if time is money and money is time, then you sacrifice time for money, and then you gave your money that helps get you time back for something that you purchased online. Interesting. So how did they convince you to give up your time? Next point. It's not what you said, but how it was said, right? So think of music and speech, right? Now, speech can be presented one way and then taken a completely different way, right? So remember earlier when I talked about DMX, right, and storytelling. There's a part in one of his songs, I think it's What's My Name, where he goes, I'm about to go against 4 niggas at one, and you think you crazy? I mean, what does that mean, right? Well, the way I hear it and the way he presents himself, and then, of course, all the analogies that I have in my head. Well, 4 in 1. What would 4 in 1 be? Oh, all for one and one for all. That would make sense, right? And then, of course, you have the SOS feature for a woman in distress where she'll put her thumb inward and then grab and go like this, right? So if you understand that, then all for one and 4 for one, whatever the case may be. But it was a musketeer reference, and you do everything you have to for one individual that's in distress or that needs your help. Yes or yes. So let's continue. First, let's adjust this camera a little bit because we have the sun directly in its place. And there we go. All right, so let's get back into it, shall we? Let me adjust here. So think about music and speech that way, right? Because if somebody were to speak like DMX, but use it in everyday language, people in certain environments would not like it. It may come off as wrong. It may, because they didn't grow up in that environment. So to them, it's not normal. So therefore, you're being aggressive and they think you're crazy. 1 second. All right, we're still good. So they'll think you're crazy, aggressive, so on and so forth. I mean, yes, if you were to act like, I hope he never takes this personally, but if you were to put off DMX or a Conor McGregor persona every time you were in public to different individuals, well, then there's a handful of things that might happen in comparison to, well, if you were to act or present yourself a different way. Hence the term presentation is 9/10 of the law, or the phrase, that is, right? Because it's not just how you look, but how you speak. See, some people can't afford or aren't comfortable in certain apparel or clothing. However, you can communicate a certain precise way so that individuals can understand the flexibility within not only your vocabulary, but the level of creativity and intelligence that you have depending on the way you present yourself, right? So music can be presented one way and it's taken fine because it strikes a emotional chord. Regular everyday communication and speech, which is choppy, sometimes slowed down, but still has about a decent beats per minute, if you understand what I'm saying, or BPM, then what's it called? You not only understand it, but well, it would be taken as such as a musical chord, right? So remember, you got DMX. If DMX was presented in everyday communication, it would be offensive. If it's in music, then it's okay. Taylor Swift, in music, it's okay. And everyday communication, she's depressed. So, I mean, think about that when it comes to moving forward. Right? And then, of course, when we get into spirituality, moving from science to there, you understand that as well. Now, let's go into another point here. So now that I've mentioned Dr. Jordan Peterson, you have case law and case study. Now, remember when I presented everything about the psychology and the science and magic within marketing and how come that can be a form of magic known as mentalism, right? Well, in the courtroom, you have case law. Well, in business, you have case studies, right? So when you want the judge to hear something or decide in a different manner, you would present case law, which is a historical fact where a judge in the past made a overruling or had a different ruling based upon circumstances at that time that line up with similar circumstances. Now, that would come into fruition if it's presented and accepted, and then they would take that into account and then present that as well, either a determination factor, right? Do I present this person as guilty or not guilty, right? Forgive me, there's some noise in the background. But let's continue, right? In business, you have a case study. Now, when it comes to a case study, that is something that comes not only from marketing and the branding and advertising field, but it's presented like case law. So to understand that analogy is to not only understand law, but to understand business, right? If you want to convince a business to do business with you, show them a similar business that you had success with, presented in a PowerPoint fashion. That is your case study of past success, and it will get accepted, and hopefully that will go into the judgment whether or not they're going to do business with you or not. All right. So why do I state this? Well, let's get into some storytelling, shall we? So what about what we are told? Does that matter? Is that part of storytelling? The things that we are told, what's accepted in society, so on and so forth. Can people get along or can they not, right? So what about the names that we have and the meaning behind those names, right? So before we get into it, let's start with some fictional characters, right? So let's talk about Daredevil and Stick, right? Daredevil was a student of Stick, and Stick was one of the leaders, or is the leader of the Chaste, right? Now, if you watch different spiritual teachers, pastors, so on and so forth, there was one that said, that God chastens his children, that, or they have other expressions, right? God only gives the hardest battles to his strongest warriors, so on and so forth. And the chaste were, in the comic book at least, fought for the side of the light and to maintain balance, right? Some other notable figures and people that came from the Chaste were, well, Shaft, yes, the one you're thinking of. You have Stone, and then Elektra, right? So when you're looking at these, right, you have to understand, okay, well, they fought for the light, this, that, and the third, but what does that have to do with anything? Well, I talked about spirituality, but in the context of Daredevil, in one side, he was a attorney, right? He was able to stand up and defend civilians in court, so on and so forth, right? And then on the other side, he was a superhero that also fought villains, so on and so forth, that were doing really bad things, etc. And then I introduced Stick, who was his mentor, older gentleman, extremely blind, so on and so forth, but had heightened senses and awarenesses that he taught to his students in order so that they can fight more efficiently and be more aware of their surroundings. So what about other names, right? Like, let's look at the name Larry or the name Steven, right? See, as we move through life, we learn certain things that we learn through story, right? So before I get into the names, if you've ever seen the movie The Count of Monte Cristo, right, there's a part in there where the priest literally tells Edmond Dantes about the treasure. And he said, you hid the treasure, so on and so forth. You lied about it, so on and so forth. And he goes, I'm a priest, not a saint. Which was very comical, but very true at the same time. And there was treasure, so on and so forth, etc. Now let's get into the names, because I think it's fascinating as we move forward and we combine stories and everything that I just said to create something of a spin-off of a creative endeavor, right? Combining a couple things, TV shows, movies, and, well, historical facts, right? So Larry means the laurel, right? Or crowned one, right? It's also a translation, right? Because Larry comes from Lawrence, right? And then it also means divine enlightenment and prophecy. And then, of course, if you were to look at the Oracle of Delphi, priestesses of Apollo had chewed laurel leaves back in the day to put them into a trance. So think of chewing on laurel leaves like dipping, so on and so forth, etc. Right? But then, of course, you have Saint Lawrence that had, well, faith, services, and spiritual courage underneath him in the Catholicism, or Catholic understanding. And then, of course, now we have Stephen. Well, Stephen in Greek, which comes from Greek, which also means crown, is Stephanos, right? He's mentioned in Acts 6:7. He was prosecuted, persecuted. Talking about legal stuff earlier, sorry. And then he was also a martyr, if I remember correctly. Outside of that, Stephen, or the crown, or Larry, the crowned one, so on and so forth, etc., is also a part of the crown chakra, or connects to the crown chakra if you were to ask Google or ChatGPT, so on and so forth. So, when you're thinking about these things, right? What's in a name? What's in a story? What's behind it, right? And you're trying to understand people. You have to understand the stories that they were told, right? And then, of course, how do they make their connections? Well, I had a bunch of connections here. Now we're going to combine, well, the myth and lore from Marvel and Daredevil and DC and things like that. But then, of course, the etymology, history, and translations in different areas of, well, the two names that I presented, right? So let's do it, right? So let me get a sip of water first. All right. So if we were to think about the TV show Green Arrow, right? Played by Stephen Amell, right? Not Stephen is a male, but Stephen Amell, right? And then, of course, he plays Oliver Queen, not in the Queen City, but he plays Oliver Queen, as well as the Green Arrow, right? Now, what's interesting is that he does embody some of the characteristics of the things that I mentioned before, right? He has courage, he has strength, he trains, he has his homeboy Diggle that hooks him up every once in a while, right? And then, of course, you have to understand that in one aspect, in the, everyday life where he's Oliver Queen, he's presented a certain way. But then in the other aspect, or the other life, he is a part of the Justice League and he is the Green Arrow, right? And then, of course, if you know Green Arrow's history, expert martial artist, background in things like Kali Salat, things like that, etc. Super BA was modeled after Batman and Robin Hood, and then they had a baby which created Green Arrow. No pun intended, but I mean, think about it, right? You have St. Lawrence, right? Which would be Larry, but that's myth and lore, but is it because it's written somewhere, right? Then, of course, you have the name Stephen Amell, the actor, etc. But did your name go somewhere else because I stated it earlier? And then, of course, the heroic figure of Green Arrow, right? What picture or image formulated or story did you tell yourself while you were listening to everything that I was presenting? See, that's the magic of not only storytelling, but the magic of creating value, not only in someone's life, but in the environment as well, right? I mean, you've seen The Wolf of Wall Street, and he always has a thing that says, sell me this pen. Now, this is a standard, cheap pen, so on and so forth. I think it says, oh baby, so on and so forth, right on it. I don't know if you guys can see that. And, it reminds me of a couple things because it was for my niece, actually, before she was born. It was a baby shower gift that they would hand out. Right? And the pen doesn't mean anything to a certain extent, unless you know what I'm referring to. But then, of course, I have this pen, and we're going to get into one last little storytelling before I hit the last 2 points. So, if you've ever seen Lord of the Rings, yes or yes, right? if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you understand the part where Gandalf goes in and saves one of the kings and pulls a spirit or removes a curse from him, so on and so forth. But he goes undercover as Gandalf the Grey. Now, why was that? See, the reason I think was to not only understand what he was dealing with and how powerful it was, but he even tried to get rid of him, so on and so forth, right? And I don't know if you know the actor, but the actor was also Magneto from X-Men, right? So if you were to look at that aspect, right? Why did he go under as Gandalf the Grey? The reason I made the analogy of Magneto is because if you watch the new animated series, Professor X left everything to Magneto. So think about it for a second, right? If anything happened to him, etc., it was in his will. Well, after he tried to remove the curse in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf that is, undercover and dressed as Gandalf the Grey, the curse or whatever that was Saruman was doing to the gentleman that was underneath this influence, hypnosis, psychological induction, right, was very brave after the thing didn't work that Gandalf the Grey did. Remember, he tried to cast something out or cast something off. He started laughing in his face, etc. And then he said, Gandalf the Grey. And he said, good, he really doesn't know who I am. And therefore, the curse or Saruman, so on and so forth, because remember, Saruman wore white as well. What's it called? Ended up speaking through him, so on and so forth, and tried to come back, well, or fight back through this individual. Now, that's when Gandalf the Grey revealed himself, right? He threw off his gray cloak, etc. This is a gray pen, but I'm going to throw that down as an example. And then, of course, he revealed that he was Gandalf the White, right? Which meant he leveled up in life. Let me fix my mic real quick. So it meant he leveled up in the movie, right? Because he went from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White. And remember, now he not only matched Saruman, but he also had his staff present, which was also different, right? Because Gandalf the Grey's staff was a little different in comparison to Gandalf the White, right? And then he was able to actually defeat the thing, restore the king back to health and his original shape and looking and features. And then from there, well, the story continues, and I'm sure you're going to go ahead and either watch it, have watched it, or at least look that part up on YouTube if you're curious about that. But think about that, right? Now, jumping to X-Men, why is it that at one point they were fighting with Magneto, but then all of a sudden everything was left to him? Remember, there was a part in there, and Magneto was a part of the Holocaust and everything like that, where he had a lot of PTSD, and he said they don't ask permission, they just do it, right? And that's where you hear people say, well, it's better to do it and ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission or whatever, right? And that's what happens in life. People do something, say, so what, it's in the past, etc., you should forget about it. And you're like, no, 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 because history is bound to repeat itself over and over again, right? So think about the two analogies between Lord of the Rings, X-Men, and everything else. If you need to back up, go ahead and do so. And if you got anything and you've been sticking with me this long, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this with other people. Now, last 2 points. What about men are from Mars and women are from Venus? That is, well, understood, not understood, etc. Is it the space? Is it the order? Is it the physics? Is it the grammar? Would the title be better if it said women are from Venus and men are from Mars, right? Well, I mean, think about that, right? What does the book talk about? It talks about the psychology, masculine and feminine energy, right? But if Mars is on one side, Venus is on the other, then wouldn't Earth be the thing where you're supposed to learn how to come together and work together in order to get along and then obviously do what you got to do in life, right? I don't know. But something to think about, right? And if you haven't read that book, do so, because it will give you more understanding, especially with the understanding from past lectures, past lessons within class. So last point, and this is multiple questions here, but for you English teachers or teachers out there in general, right? Or students out there that are currently listening to this. Why is the Iliad taught in school that was written by Homer? Now, mind you, not Homer Simpson, but why is the Iliad taught in school that was written by Homer? Right? The Iliad discusses things like Odysseus, right? And his travels on the Odyssey. It talks about Icarus, you know. And then, of course, you have other books that you might possibly read, like Canterbury Tales, so on and so forth, which a movie that was pulled from there, which is called A Knight's Tale, right? But it was written by Chaucer, and Chaucer was the name of the gentleman who spoke in the movie, if you remember that. He played Jarvis, as well as Michael in the movie Legion. But, why is that taught in school? Does it matter? Do you care? Why does school care to teach your children that, right? And teach you that? And then, do you care about secrets when others do not? So who cares, right? And then, of course, if nobody values secrets, what's the point in having them? So this is the last and final point, and this was point 12. Now, mind you, this was lesson 39, which obviously 3, 6, 9, 3 and 9 add up to, 12. 12 plus 12 will give you, 24. 12 times 12 will give you, 144. And I am so excited for the first lesson of spirituality, where we're going to get into some things and break through some psychologies that I've seen get reflected on multiple occasions. So until next time, my friends, take care. Mwah. Peace.